Bibliophiles of the internet, my name's Adriana, and today I'm here to share my December wrap-up. The first thing I read/listened to in December was The Lost Sisters by Holly Black, read by Caitlin Kelly. This is a novella meant to be read between the cruel prince and the wicked king, and I think it exists for two reasons. One, to further flesh out Jude's twin sister Taryn and to explore the surprising choices she made in the first book, and two, to give a broad strokes type recap of the cruel prince. And frankly, it successfully does both of those things. If you've read The Cruel Prince, you know the main character Jude is very headstrong and takes a lot of risks, while her twin sister Taryn is the complete opposite. She's quiet, fearful, obedient, and complacent, or so it seems. I think this novella makes a case for quote-unquote playing by the rules and shows that there is a kind of strength in keeping your thoughts beneath the surface and taking actions that register as less obvious. And it also speaks to how women are expected to be polite and complacent if they want to be taken seriously, and how their behaviors are very strongly policed in the interest of that. There's a repeated, almost sing-song line in this novella that says, be bold, but not too bold. Be good, but not too good. Be pretty, but not too pretty. Be honest, but not too honest. So again, that speaks to how we expect women especially to be strong and decisive, but only when it's convenient and only in ways that don't take away from anyone else. We want women to be digestible, to be easy to understand, and you see Taryn struggling with those internalized expectations, which in turn drives her to make some disruptive choices. I really enjoyed this interlude of sorts, and I think it served its purpose to recap the story and bring some more depth to a really interesting and integral side character who we don't really get too much from in the first book. So if you're looking for a refresher before The Wicked King and you don't want to have to reread an entire book, you should definitely check this out. After that, it was the Queer Lit Read-a-thon, which I got to help co-host, and it was such a blast. I read 6 queer books in 1 week, and I actually made a full separate wrap-up just for those books. I was able to read Fire Song, This Is Kind of an Epic Love Story, Ivy Aberdeen's Letter to the World, Coffee Boy, Check Please, and Girls of Paper and Fire. So if you want my full unabridged commentary on those books, that wrap-up will be posted down below for you to check out as you please. The first thing I read after the Queer Lit Read-a-thon was Stardust by Neil Gaiman, read by the author himself. It's about Tristan Thorne, who is hopelessly in love with a girl named Victoria, who says she will give him anything he wants, including her heart, if he goes to fetch a fallen star. The problem is this star lies beyond the walls surrounding his village, a wall that no one has ever crossed, and what lies beyond is magic that will challenge everything Tristan thinks he knows. As you would expect from Gaiman, this story is clever, whimsical, full of imagination and creativity, and just an enjoyable read from front to back. I would definitely say I connected with that humor and levity the most. I'm very partial to nonsensical magical worlds where these new creatures and phenomena challenge the hero to push past what they believe about the world and how they understand it. I also like how the story would sometimes pull back and focus on these microscopic details or storylines happening on the outskirts of Tristan's adventure, especially because none of those details went to waste. In some way or another, by the end, every detail came back to create a big picture moment. That said, I see a lot of people who clutch this book to their chest and proclaim it to be a work of utter genius, and I definitely do not feel the urge to do that myself. I felt really uncomfortable with the romance in this story when Tristan falls in love with the fallen star Yvain, especially because she lacks any sense of agency or choice. It's not until like 2/3 of the book, after he's basically kidnapped this injured woman to take back to his lady love, that he even asks her what she wants. And even then he's still like, well, let me take care of my thing first. I like the way they challenge each other, and I enjoyed the banter and the hijinks, but it was hard for me to believe that Yvain would develop any kind of romantic feelings for someone who doesn't show her any kind of fundamental respect. So in the end, I wasn't totally on board with everything this book was attempting to do, but it was a very creative and unique fairy tale world, so I gave it 3 stars. Then I finally read/listened to Revenant Gun by Yoon-ha Lee, read by Emily Woo Zeller. I have so much love for this complex, mathematically based universe because it's elaborate, but it's not unknowable. It's not beyond comprehension. It's organized and exact. There's an elegance to how all of the battle formations depend on geometry and algorithms, and that even impacts how these characters engage with culture itself. Those mathematical principles spill over into day-to-day interactions because these characters are making calculated moves based on fragmented information. They are trying to project the results they want when they're only given half of what they need to know. That shit is math, and it is malleable and elegant as fuck. This trilogy also explores heretics, which are basically people who make their own choices and go against formation instinct. And this phenomenon of breaking formation is actually a good thing, because doing things differently is how we discover new ways to exist, new ways to organize and logically frame the universe. This final book also questions what it means to survive and how we decide who gets to survive in the first place, which are often two different things. There's also interesting takes on commander versus the commanded and how to negotiate power dynamics in extreme situations, especially when, for these characters, there are no good choices. But most importantly, even though this trilogy is positioned as a hard militaristic space opera, the true beauty of it comes from Yoon Ha Lee's attention to these irrevocably human moments. You don't need to understand how a sheer canon works, but you will be able to key into this narrative because you will know which characters love watering their plants, the dramas they like to watch, the foods they like to eat, which games they gravitate towards. By understanding the tiny distinctions of humanity in each of these factions and these characters, you see how the machine works. And there's such great contrast between the overall big picture of these all-powerful commanders ruthlessly seeking immortal life and the people beneath their notice who don't even register as remotely important, who are vital in disrupting those schemes. Clearly, I have a lot of big feelings about this trilogy and I will forever sing its praises. I gave this final installment 4.5 stars. After that, as we got closer to Christmas, I picked up Green Glass House by Kate Milford, read by Chris Henry Kofi. This is a middle grade mystery story about Milo, who was adopted by these two innkeepers whose patrons happen to be mostly smugglers and thieves. It's very early in the holiday season when the inn is suddenly swarming with a bunch of odd, secretive guests who all come bearing strange stories that somehow connect back to the inn itself. It's not long until things go missing and the guests become more and more paranoid, and it's up to Milo to decipher the clues and uncover the truth about Green Glass House. I love this book a lot. It was a pleasant surprise to see a role-playing D&D type element in this story because we rarely get to see kids exploring those kinds of immersive games. And role-playing itself, that is, the creation of character, is a form of expression in this book. It's an exploratory space where Milo can be free of the limitations he projects on himself. And his character, Nigret, has permission to do the things Milo thinks he can't, which pushes him to go to new places. It's even more interesting because Milo is prone to anxiety and panic attacks, especially when things don't go the way he expects. And playing within the parameters of this fictional game makes Milo feel like he can regain a sense of control over his life. This new role, this new identity is something that Milo gets to choose. Another remarkable thing is that this story is made up of other stories, and the act of storytelling itself is a main fixture in progressing the plot. On one hand, it's about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world as it changes around us, to bring ourselves a sense of comfort. But it's also a book where stories, or pieces of stories, are layering themselves over one another as it continues, and each new piece changes the entire landscape of the story itself. The narrative also explores adoption and the feeling of being other, of being lost, of not knowing where you come from and not really knowing how you can begin to safely question that. And that's something that's actually very close to the author, who is an adoptive parent herself. Ultimately, the story shows that there is power in being different, because then people don't know what to expect. And while that's scary, that's also a very freeing experience. I'm so glad I read this. I gave it 4 stars. Then I finally listened to Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory by Caitlin Doty, read by the author herself. This is an unconventional coming-of-age memoir about Caitlin's early years working as a mortician and professional cremation operator as she explores the death industry, death rituals and practices, and how Western culture understands death itself. In this memoir, Caitlin's knowledge, experience, and research lend itself to a very informative text. It's slightly graphic, but not unnecessarily so. Any descriptions of corpses, the treatment of corpses, and the process of decay are factual and objective as opposed to being sensationalized or extorted in any way. And she's able to maintain both a sense of humor and respective distance while still giving the reader the means to confront mortality on the page. Doty really makes a case for why distance from death and ignorance of death practices does not give us power over death. When we fail to interrogate what comes after death, physically, emotionally, spiritually, we do ourselves a disservice and forfeit any agency we have over this very important personal subject. It was also great to see how this memoir pulls sources from philosophy, academia, industry professionals, and also cites death rituals and practices from around the world, which is really fascinating to read about. In that way, she's able to show that there is validity in every practice. There's also a really great balance between Caitlin's personal narrative and the analysis of the death industry itself. As the memoir progresses, you see how Caitlin's relationship with death has evolved from before she joined the industry and afterwards. She also had to work at undoing her preconceptions about death, dignity, and mortality, which is truly necessary work we should all take on ourselves. This was such an amazing, essential text. I gave it 5 stars. Then I finally read Jasmine Guillory's The Proposal, which is a companion/sequel to The Wedding Date. It's a romance that begins with a public proposal gone wrong when the girlfriend in question, Nicole, rejects her boyfriend of 5 months in front of a stadium full of baseball fans. Our Latinx superhero Carlos is also at the game, and he immediately rushes in to save Nick from the cameras. Not long afterwards, the two of them embark on a steamy, breezy rebound, but is it too good to last? What I love about Jasmine Guillory's brand of romance is that there's a wonderful balance of conflict both within and beyond the central romantic relationship. These characters both have deep-seated traumas that they have to work through together and for themselves. Carlos is dealing with his father's death and a toxic sense of machismo he's given himself over to ever since. He believes it's his place to do everything for the women in his life because that's what his dad did, even though as fully independent women, they do push back against that instinct. Nick is incredibly independent, which is both a strength and a weakness. She's used to doing everything herself, regulating her work, controlling her schedule, living her life, but sometimes she takes on too much. And she's also been through some bad breakups, including the latest, which makes her hesitant to trust. Nick doesn't want to be vulnerable with anyone else, and neither does Carlos, which does not make for lasting relationships. So they both have these very clearly drawn lines around themselves, and then they unconsciously cross each other's lines in this relationship, which ultimately forces them to confront these pieces of themselves. For me, this story has a lasting impact because the romance is not the sole factor that is driving these characters. And I also appreciate how this story emphasizes that vulnerability is not just like letting yourself cry in front of someone else. It's allowing yourself to laugh and open up and trust. It's letting someone else know that you feel safe in their presence. And these two characters definitely experience that. Plus, there's awesome sex where female pleasure is at the forefront. It's steamy, suggestive, but not too overly descriptive or graphic, so if that's your sweet spot, you should definitely look into this. I love this, maybe even more than the first book, and I gave it 4.5 stars. And lastly, my poetry collection for December was Tesoro by Jessica Salgado. This collection is about Jessica's life as a Salvadorian American poet. It's about being immersed in 2 different cultures and languages, but it's also a collective about the women in her life and how they have survived different kinds of hardships, which very much informs how Jessica carries herself as an adult. When we think of what it means to survive, I think we gravitate towards those big forms of loss: death, abuse, addiction, illness, and this collection definitely explores all of those topics. But it also gives credit to people who survive placelessness, self-doubt, mischaracterization, disrespect, being unseen. All of these things that are so commonplace and so easy to internalize. And there's a real sense of communion in these poems, which often show the speaker banding together with their family, their friends, their lovers, in order to make it through this world and gain a better understanding of self. This poet also always brings a sense of empowerment in her work. In this collection, she says, "I assign meaning to things in my life. I know what I want. I explore this life on my own terms that I dictate for myself." I love that Jessica Salgado is not out here to please anyone but herself. She is not all-powerful, she is not without fear or doubt or faults, but by loving these women and this life, she is able to love herself. She is nothing less than complete. Needless to say, I love this collection so much and I gave it 5 stars. So those are all the books I read in the month of December. As always, if you've read any of them yourself, I would love to discuss further in the comments. But that's everything I have for this wrap up today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and I'll catch you on the flip side of the page.